Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, it's the economy. From Berlin to Beijing to Washington, elections, leadership changes, remaking the euro. It is decision time, and we're cutting through the jargon to explain how it affects your part of the world. And that includes places like Spain on the brink of a full bailout, and with a province like Catalunya which can't even pay its workers. And living on $4 a day, it's difficult at the best of times, but with rising food prices, how much worse could it get? So we're looking at a crucial few weeks for the global economy. The European Central Bank will unleash the mother of all bond buy-ups. There is the ongoing lead-up to the US elections, of course. New communist leadership due in China as well. These are all things which have potential long-term impacts. Look at the eurozone first of all, where the ECB is about to spend billions on buying debt. There's also the question over Spain needing a full bailout, and whether the European Union, the ECB and the IMF, the Troika, will give Greece more money to pay back the money they already gave them. And there's the US, which a year ago lost its AAA credit rating from Standard & Poor's. The concern at the time was ballooning debt and the debt ceiling. So if that didn't already annoy the Obama administration, then that very debt hitting $16 trillion right in the middle of the Republican National Convention sure would have. Not to say it didn't rise under President George Bush too, but it's the type of stuff which could really return to haunt Washington post-elections. And China's a feature too. The economy there is slowing. Local authorities are piling on debts. The banks are even setting aside money for bad loans. The economy could slow below the government's target of 7.5%. But with new leadership about to be installed, who's going to be thinking about big economic change? These are all things we'll discuss in an extended interview on this program with two leading economists. Before that, though, an example of what a debt crisis is really all about. Andrew Simmons takes us to Catalunya, one of 3 Spanish states requesting billions from Madrid.
Barcelona's beach may be a playground for tourists, but for Spaniards here, the summer holidays are over. And a grim reality is sinking in. The region of Catalunya can't afford to pay its public service workforce and needs a bailout from central government. All this in a week when complex rises in indirect taxes are imposed. Parents of children returning from school holidays faced with a tax increase from 4% to 18% for their stationery. Clothes and luxury goods up from 18 to 21%, meat up from 8 to 10%, the same increase for fish. In this traditional Catalan restaurant, they've decided not to pass on the increases to customers, like many hard-pressed retailers. But they say it won't be long before they have to put up prices and business will plummet. Jose Gomez, who's worked in this restaurant since he was 15, says that after 40 years, he's never been so disillusioned.
I'm scared because I'm 55 years old and I don't want to find myself unemployed in the last years of my life, like so many people. I'm scared.
You might think that the campaign for Catalan independence would be harmed by moves to get a bailout from Madrid. But politicians wanting that full breakaway say it's actually helping them, simply because central government takes more than it gives to Catalunya.
We have to ask for a bailout because what Madrid has been giving us, which is a fraction of what we've been paying in taxes, is not enough to sustain the administration. Then there's humiliation in the air, and we feel that apart from the rip-off, we have also been trodden upon.
And now the Catalan government ruling party, which has been pushing for economic independence, not a full breakaway, is warning Madrid it has to come up with a fairer deal.
If they basically neglect the right of the Catalan people to receive part or a more substantial part of the money that they are paying through their taxes, the response will be obvious and will be clear. And the Catalan people might be more inclined to ask for a secession from Spain.
That's a prospect people like Jose Gomez have long regarded as unlikely, but it's a threat that puts even more pressure on Spain's hard-pressed government.
Now, before the ECB laid out its plan to buy up these unlimited amounts of bonds, we invited 2 prominent, but crucially straight-talking and easy-to-understand economists to join us for a chat about the possibilities for this global economy. From UBS, we had global economist Paul Donovan, and also the lead economist from the World Economic Forum, Jennifer Blank. Collectively, here's what the 3 of us came up with. Paul Donovan and Jennifer Blank, thank you so much for joining us this week on Counting the Cost. I'm kind of calling this segment this week global economic crossroads, because I feel we're at a point where some decisions have got to be made in the next few weeks and months, and we're talking political decisions, we're talking economic decisions, all sorts of things which may finally have some bearing on how this global economic crisis goes forward. So I think we'll start with the European Central Bank, the ECB. Paul, let's start with you, get your views on this first. Are we at a point where it looks like the ECB will start to finally buy up some debt? And explain to us what that will actually do, what impact that will actually have.
They've got to be careful. They can't go too far because we haven't yet had the German Constitutional Court ruling on assistance. And so the ECB doesn't want to commit itself too much until it knows the German legality, the political environment. But yes, I think they're going to buy debt. And what they're going to do is buy short-term debt. They won't buy long-term debt. They're going to say to governments, look, you want to borrow for 10 years, you've got to convince investors that you're sensible, that your policies are right. But what we will make sure is that you won't run out of money. And by doing that, they can guarantee that the euro will continue as a relatively stable monetary union, that the euro isn't going to break up or anything silly like that.
What long-term impact might it have? Paul's just said that, you know, short-term, yeah, it'll keep the euro afloat, but really, is it just passing the buck down the road?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's clear, and this is a discussion that's also happening in the U.S. In terms of the central bank discussions. But, you know, the shorter term, sort of shoring up of confidence and also, you know, dealing with the sovereign debt crisis are very important. But one thing coming out of our global competitiveness report that's very clear is that, you know, and I'm not going to belittle what they're doing. They need to actually really, you know, decide what to do and move really quickly with it, is that there needs to be more focus on the long term and a lot of the things that are really creating this competitiveness gap between many of the eurozone countries. You have some, such as, you know, the Netherlands and Germany, that are really doing very well. They're in the top 10. These are very productive economies. They can basically support the high wages that they have. And compared with countries such as Greece, that really, you know, not only are having difficulties in their financial markets and in terms of their sort of sovereign debt issues, but also are simply just not competitive. They cannot support the high wages, and they need a lot of other reforms to their labor markets and others, and to become more innovative more generally.
So the two-tier eurozone idea is still alive, sort of, you think?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is that every time that you have a currency area like this, you're probably going to have some regions that are doing better than others. You have this in the U.S. and you have this elsewhere. You know, the reality is, I think, you know, you know, I think that finance experts are better than I am to go into the details, but there's never really been a currency zone without some sort of centralized mechanism, some sort of centralized federal mechanism for transferring of funds.
Paul, let's come back to you. I'm sure you've got plenty to say on that, but I do want to move to some other topics as well, because Jennifer's just talked about, yeah, those who are doing well and those who aren't. One that clearly isn't doing well is Spain. The talk of necessity for a full bailout. Again, is this an inevitable sort of thing as well?
Spain has made it fairly clear that they will consider asking for assistance, but only when they know the terms of the assistance that they will be offered. And we're in this rather unusual situation. If the markets believe that Spain's going to be helped, then bond yields in Spain will stay low and Spain won't need to ask for help. If markets believe that Spain is not going to be helped, then bond yields in Spain will go up, Spain won't be able to finance itself, and it will have to ask for help. I think that provided Spain can get the right terms, which is to say, not very many terms at all, not very many conditions at all, it may well have to ask for help. The bank bailouts, which Spain's going to have to bear the cost of, are going to raise its debt-GDP ratio probably to 90–95% of GDP over time. The Spanish banking system is just not going to lend money. Spain is going to experience, in our view, 2 years of negative GDP growth in a row. Now, that's the first time that's happened in Spain since 1958. So the first time in 54 years, Spain has 2 years negative GDP in a row. Frankly, in that situation, I think they'd be wise to ask for help.
And while we're talking about needing help, Jennifer, I will come back to you in a moment. Just bear with me. I want to stay with Paul to talk about Greece briefly as well, which will probably need another tranche of money from the Troika as well. The thing is, aren't we getting to a point where in Greece's case, if it takes more money from the Troika, it's just kind of taking more money to pay back the Troika from the original money, and the debt's not being dealt with here, is it?
The debt's not being dealt with, and frankly, in my view, Greece will have to default again at some point, just not right now. Now, to be fair to Greece, the Troika came along and they said, look, we think Greece is going to grow at about -3.5%, -3.7% this year. Greece is never going to grow at -3.5% this year. It's going to grow at -8%. The Troika was making totally unrealistic assumptions when it came up with the original fiscal timetable. So what I think they're going to do is they're going to give Greece more time. And by giving Greece more time, that does mean they've got to give Greece more money up front. We will kick the can down the road, as the expression is. But ultimately, I think the Troika knows, and frankly, I think the Greek government knows, they can't let Greece fail. They can't let Greece leave the eurozone. If Greece leaves the eurozone, I give it 6 weeks. Spain, Portugal and Ireland will be out as well. You can't make an irrevocable monetary union break up, because then everybody speculates about who's next. So everybody's got to work to try and make this situation more secure with regards to Greece.
Jennifer, your long-term view, the way that Paul describes that about Greece, as he quite rightly said, kick the can down the road. I think I got that confused earlier, but Greece's long-term prospects are not good.
A lot more focus, we think, needs to be placed on those longer-term issues rather than sort of paying lip service to it. I mean, some people are talking about growth policies, and we hear this coming out of France, for example, and somehow that has to do with more spending, more stimulus. And really, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about freeing up the labor markets, making it easier to basically let people go so that companies have some impetus to hire, making it easier to start companies, inspiring entrepreneurship and things of that nature. And I mean, really, without this, it does seem like you keep sort of, putting another Band-Aid on the problem rather than saying, okay, we recognize that this is a serious problem. We have to really kickstart the economy. We need to do a lot of serious things, and it's going to take a long time to actually bear fruit in some cases because, frankly, a lot of these things, do require some patience. And unfortunately, it seems that we're seeing a lot of impatience among political leaders right now.
Folks, let's move to another point of discussion. And Jennifer, you did allude to this before. I want to go into some detail now. The situation in the United States. Debt, which is now up over $16 trillion. And for the Republicans, it was a nice symbolic moment because it happened in the middle of their convention in Tampa, Florida. Jennifer, let's stay with you for the start of this. I mean, regardless of who wins this election in November, Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, they inherit this debt. What can either of them do with it?
Unless the two parties get together and start honestly having a discussion, and some plans have been floated and then forgotten about, then it really almost doesn't matter who gets in. There is way too much short-termism in the U.S.
Paul, the bickering is one thing, and clearly it holds things back. But the economic situation as well, you're not going to be able to put a dent in that sort of number when unemployment is still poor, when the general economy is still so flat there.
Well, I mean, I think that we've got to recognise there has been a degree of fiscal tightening in the States already. It's not the case that fiscal policy is boosting growth at the moment. Fiscal policy is actually reducing growth in America already, so there is some tightening. Now, a lot of the tightening so far has been at a state and local government level rather than a federal level, and obviously the focus over time has got to shift to the federal level. So we've got to recognise that part of the reason we've got weak growth now is that there is some fiscal tightening going on. As we look ahead, I think, and I agree with Jennifer here, what we need is a plan. What we need is something which says to markets, look, we are going to get this under control. It's not going to be under control in 12 months, but it's going to be under control over a time. These are the targets. These are the measures you can use to judge us by. Without being accused of undue patriotism, this is what the British government did when they came into office. They set out a plan that was a credible plan that they've by and large met. They said to the markets, look, this is what we think we can do. We're not going to do it all in one go. It's over a 5-7 year period. But bear in mind that if we do this, it will work in the end. Give us some credit for that. That, I think, is what we would like to see from the United States. Of course, the US political structure doesn't lend itself so well to that sort of long-term planning, as does the UK political structure. The separation of powers in the States is a challenge.
Right, final topic on my list today is China. I think we have to address this because of its sheer scale and scope and effect on the rest of the world. The fact is, Paul, we'll start with you. The fact is, this slowdown is real. It was talked about for a long time that the double-digit growth in China couldn't be sustained for that long. The slowdown has finally come. Tell me about domestic effect, the effect on China first of all. We'll deal with everyone else in a moment, but first of all, tell me about the possible effects on China.
Well, the slowdown was inevitable. I mean, China's trend rate of growth over the next 5 years is probably about 5.5%. We're currently running at about 8% growth this year. I think that the Chinese government will achieve 8% this year and next year. But what's got to happen in China, this is absolutely critical, China has got to shift from being an economy where growth is purely about export-led growth to one which is more about domestic-led growth. And that's what it's doing at the moment.
But
now,
that's a big turnaround, though, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole, you know, a big ship, a big tanker trying to turn it around, and how long it takes to turn it around.
Well, it's not as big a turnaround as some people think. Exports are about 10% of the value added of the Chinese economy. That's, you know, they're a tenth of the economy. The consumer at the moment is hovering about at half the economy. Now, it's not actually taking that much to say, okay, well, you know, the export sector, which has not been strong for the last 4 years, obviously, you know, we can't rely on the export sector, so we're going to build social housing, we're going to invest in agriculture, which is a huge problem in China. We're going to develop domestic infrastructure. It's not that big a change. Now, it's a little bit clumsy because it is a change, and you know, nobody likes change. You've got to move people to new jobs, change workers around. But that seems to be underway in China. We are getting this more domestic focus. And frankly, in China at the moment, you know, the unemployment isn't a problem. People's incomes are rising. You know, we don't have social unrest on a large scale or anything like that. It's reflecting, I think, the success of some of these policies.
Jennifer, one of the issues longer term, I guess, the fact is that we have got leadership change coming in China. And as Paul says, you know, people have got to, they're wary of change. But whoever comes in China, again, much as it is in the US, it's got to be about some sort of stability as well, and making sure that this transition to a more domestic-focused economy happens and happens smoothly and doesn't, you know, there's no falling off a cliff here.
Exactly, and I would actually say that in the case of China, it's maybe a bit easier because transitions of power don't actually imply the same sorts of shifts in policy that you might see elsewhere. And so in China, actually, you know, one of the things that we've been seeing is that they've sort of been steadily, this year they've weakened a little bit, but in general, over the years, they've been improving and really, you know, chipping away at their weaknesses over time. And so, I mean, I think from our corner, we really do expect to see continuing improvement, maybe slowing down a little bit, but I think it's normal when countries reach middle income status that they start to slow a bit.
Paul Donovan from UBS and Jennifer Blank from the World Economic Forum. I want to thank you both for joining us on Counting the Cost today. Really appreciate it. Now, our other story this week is food prices. One of those ongoing issues that kind of comes and goes from the spotlight. You'll remember the 2008 food crisis. Well, prices are starting to head towards those highs again, and the main culprit is a catastrophic drought in the United States and also poor crops from Eastern Europe. But who and where gets hit the most? Try Nairobi's Kibera slum as an example. Peter Grester went there to find out more.
Flora Mocker lives in what's known as the microeconomy, that sector of society so poor they can only afford tiny amounts of food as each day's earnings come in. After rent, she has about $4 a week to live off. Buying small and buying often is the only way to shop as rising prices outstrip her ability to buy more than a day's supplies.
Even if I earn about $1.20 in one day, it still isn't enough for me to buy the food I need for us.
The microeconomy includes almost every product that can be reduced and repackaged into tiny quantities. Paradoxically, it is far more expensive than buying in bulk, but for the poorest living on a daily income from casual jobs, there is no other way. And because they spend about 60% of their incomes on food, even the slightest shift in price has an enormous impact.
A recent UN report found that about a third of Kenyans living in urban areas are chronically malnourished. But Africa's slums are also growing at a rate faster than almost anywhere else in the world. So more and more people living in these areas simply can't afford to buy the food they need to keep themselves healthy.
That doesn't just hurt individuals. It makes the entire workforce less productive, more vulnerable to disease. The national economy suffers. That's why the World Food Programme believes that helping them makes economic sense.
Working to increase what's called resilience, the ability of populations to withstand price shocks by having so-called safety nets, something to protect the people.
But with no safety net, it often means surviving on what most of us would throw out without a second thought. Not only is the fish sold in micro quantities, it is hardly fit for consumption. I'll fry it for my dinner, he says. There isn't much meat on the bones, but what can I do? It is all I can afford. It is all many more people will be able to afford if the price of cereals continues to rise at the rate economists predict.
Now, all that said, there is some conjecture over how acute any food price crisis might actually be right now. We're going to talk about that with David Hallam. He is Director of the Trade and Markets Division at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, joining us from Rome. David, your argument is that there isn't an acute food price crisis, but, you know, if we're looking at anything near the 2008 problems, what does that say about preparedness and dealing with the core issues?
Well, I think first of all to say that we are not anywhere near an immediate crisis. We've got some very specific problems with harvests in the US and in Russia, which have been affected by drought, and they've put prices up. Not yet to the level of 2007-8, and a lot of the factors that were present then, which added to pressures to raise prices, are not present today. So we don't have record high oil prices, we don't have very strong world demand, we don't have speculative inflow of funds into commodity markets. So there's a lot of things missing. So the world is a little bit better prepared in international terms, and at national level too. I think many countries since 2007-8 have put in place mechanisms to help them to cope better with volatile prices on world markets, which we usually describe as safety net mechanisms. So various kinds of targeted consumer subsidies, food for education, food for work, things like that are in place.
But what about dealing with the things that mechanisms can't really deal with? I'm talking specifically about the droughts, situations you mentioned just before, particularly the United States at the moment, which cannot be controlled in any way. It's the weather. You can't deal with these things. Do you think, though, in another 4, 6, 8 months' time, we could see yet more knock-on effects from this?
Well, I think that the drought impacting on U.S. maize production and U.S. and Russian wheat production, the damage is now done. What we're looking forward to, and sorry, the impact of that has been to reduce global stock levels, which is a bad thing. What we're looking forward to now, though, is to see what happens in the southern hemisphere. We're coming into the planting season right now, and hopefully the high prices which we've seen now, which are a problem for consumers, hopefully they might encourage a positive response from farmers in the southern hemisphere.
But what about helping those, inevitably we talk about the most vulnerable, and I'm just looking at a news release here from the World Bank, and it only came out last week. And it talks about how these high food prices threaten the poor of this world. I mean, it's just a perpetual thing, isn't it? Those who can least afford it are always the ones who get hit the hardest.
That's right. I mean, and this is not only at an individual level, it's at a country level as well. Families who are spending 60-70% of their income on food. So any increases in food prices are very serious implications for them. And what we've observed in the past is, in response to food price hikes, is that in some cases these families reduce their food consumption full stop, or they substitute less nutritious but cheaper foods, or often they try and maintain their food intake by cutting back on their other expenditures, things like schooling, medicines and so on, which can have longer term damage in terms of eroding, as economists call it, human capital.
That's David Hallam from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organisation. Thank you for joining us, David.
A great pleasure.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week. If you want to get in touch, though, here's how you do it. Twitter's the easiest way, actually. You can send a tweet to me at KamalAJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. And if you're not on Twitter, the email address is there for you, countingthecost@aljazeera.net. While you're online, head to aljazeera.com/business. There's a link there at the top to our page. Catch up with all our past episodes if you like, whenever you'd like. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.